In the winter of 1885, beneath the vast, unyielding sky of Montana, a young woman named Eleanor Harper stepped off a train in the rugged outpost of Willow Creek. Her worldly possessions were confined to a single, weathered trunk, her heart tethered to a dream spun from ink and paper. She had journeyed over 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to marry a man she had never met, a man who promised her a new life in the untamed West. But with one glance he deemed her unworthy, not for her looks or her manners, but for the silence that cloaked her, a silence born of trauma rather than choice. In an era when a woman's voice was often her only currency, Eleanor found herself stranded in a frontier town where her quietude was mistaken for weakness. Yet, as the winds of fate often do, they carried her to an unexpected ally, a deaf rancher named Caleb Thornton, who saw in her silence not a flaw, but a profound beauty. This is the story of a woman who could barely speak, finding her voice in the most unlikely of places, beside a man who could not hear. Before we dive into this tale, I'd love to know where you're reading from. And if this story stirs your soul, be sure to follow along, as I have something special waiting for you tomorrow. Chapter 1: The Arrival. The February wind bit through Eleanor Harper's woolen coat as she stepped onto the wooden platform of Willow Creek's modest train station. Her gloved fingers clutched a letter, its creases worn from countless readings that had lured her to this remote corner of Montana territory. 6 months of correspondence with James Caldwell, a prosperous merchant, had culminated in a marriage proposal and a one-way ticket west. At 28, Eleanor knew this might be her last chance for a husband and a family of her own. She scanned the platform, searching for the man she knew only through a faded tintype and his florid handwriting. James had described himself as a man of means, owner of a 2-story mercantile and a fine house, eager for a refined Eastern lady to bring culture to this burgeoning settlement. In her letters, Eleanor had been honest about everything, save for the fact that she rarely spoke. A bout of typhoid fever 5 years prior had claimed her parents and younger sister, leaving her voice a fragile whisper, often failing her entirely. A portly man in an ill-fitting suit approached, his eyes darting between Eleanor and a photograph in his hand. "Miss Harper," he called, his voice carrying over the whistle of the departing train. Eleanor nodded, offering a tentative smile. James Caldwell was not as handsome as his picture suggested, his face rounder and his hair thinner, but Eleanor hadn't come for love. She sought stability, a fresh start far from the pitying glances of Philadelphia society. "I'm James. Welcome to Willow Creek." He made no move to assist with her trunk, instead scrutinizing her face with growing displeasure. "You look older than your photograph." Eleanor's cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. The journey was long. James's eyebrows shot up. "What's wrong with your voice?" She retrieved a small slate and chalk from her reticule, tools she had grown accustomed to, and wrote, "Illness affected my voice. I can speak, but it's difficult." James read the slate, his frown deepening. "You didn't mention this in your letters." Eleanor wrote again, "I express myself better in writing." "I hoped it wouldn't matter." "Wouldn't matter," James scoffed. "I run a store. I need a wife who can charm customers, not one who scribbles like a schoolgirl." The curious stares of passers-by burned into Eleanor as she stood on the platform, humiliation washing over her. 6 days of travel, her entire savings spent on this journey, and now she faced rejection before even leaving the station. "This won't do," James said, stepping back. "I can't marry a woman who can't greet customers properly." "You weren't honest, Miss Harper." Her hand trembled as she wrote, "I can work. I can help in other ways. I advertised for a wife, not a burden." James replied coldly. "The eastbound train leaves tomorrow morning. I suggest you be on it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor alone beside her trunk, the wind whipping her skirts and tears welling in her eyes. "Don't mind James Caldwell," a voice called from behind. Eleanor turned to see an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. "I'm Abigail Thornton," the woman said. "I run the boarding house. Come, child. You need a place to rest tonight." Abigail didn't wait for a reply, gesturing for a boy to fetch Eleanor's trunk. As they walked down the muddy Main Street, Abigail spoke plainly. "James Caldwell has brought 3 mail-order brides to Willow Creek in 2 years. None lasted a week. His expectations are higher than the Rockies, and his character's lower than a snake's belly." Eleanor reached for her slate, but Abigail waved it off. "No need now. You look exhausted. We'll talk after you've rested and had a hot meal." The boarding house was clean and warm, with simple furnishings and the aroma of fresh cornbread in the air. Abigail led Eleanor to a small but cozy room on the 2nd floor. "Supper's at 6, Abigail said. "Rest now. Tomorrow's soon enough to sort things out." Alone in the room, Eleanor let her tears fall. The weight of her situation pressed down. Stranded in a frontier town with just enough money for a return ticket, but nowhere to return to. She had sold her family's home and most of their possessions to fund this new life. Now, all she had was a trunk of dresses too fine for a place like Willow Creek and a crushing sense of failure. Chapter 2: A Glimmer of Hope. That evening at supper, Abigail introduced Eleanor to the other boarders. 2 schoolteachers from the newly built schoolhouse, a young lawyer, and a widow who served as the town's seamstress. As Abigail explained Eleanor's plight, the group exchanged knowing glances. "James Caldwell's a fool," one teacher, a forthright woman named Clara, declared. "Any man who rejects a bride for being quiet has never valued the peace of a silent evening." Eleanor wrote on her slate, "I have enough for a ticket east, but there's nothing waiting for me there." "Can you sew?" the seamstress Margaret Hayes asked. Eleanor nodded. She had always excelled at needlework. "I could use help in my shop," Margaret offered. "At least until you decide your next step." For the first time since arriving, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. The next morning, instead of boarding the eastbound train, Eleanor followed Margaret to a small shop off the main street. A bell jingled as they entered a space filled with bolts of fabric, pattern books, and half-finished garments. "Most folks here can't afford ready-made clothes," Margaret explained, "and those who can still prefer custom work. With the town growing, I've got more orders than I can handle." Eleanor spent the day assisting Margaret, cutting patterns and hemming edges. Her precise stitches and keen eye for detail earned a satisfied smile from the older woman. "You've got a gift, Eleanor. Your hands speak for you." Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor settled into a routine, working at the seamstress shop by day and returning to Abigail's boarding house at night. She began to recognize the townsfolk who visited the shop, though few attempted conversation with the mute lady from the east, as she overheard herself described. In her 3rd week in Willow Creek, everything changed. Eleanor was alone in the shop. Margaret had stepped out to deliver a finished gown when the bell announced a customer. She looked up to see a tall man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with broad shoulders and a sun-weathered face. His dark hair was slightly long, and his clothes, though clean, bore the marks of hard labor. Eleanor rose from her work table and nodded in greeting. The man didn't return the gesture, instead studying her face intently. She wrote on her slate, "How may I help you?" The man continued to stare, confusion flickering across his features. Then, to Eleanor's astonishment, his hands began to move in deliberate gestures. She recognized them instantly as the sign language she had learned during her recovery, when doctors feared she might never speak again. He was spelling out, "Need shirt repaired." He pointed to a tear in the sleeve of the shirt he wore, then made additional signs Eleanor didn't understand. It dawned on her he wasn't rude. He was deaf. Eleanor set down her slate and carefully signed back, "I can fix it." The man's face lit up with a radiant smile. He quickly shed his jacket, then, without a hint of self-consciousness, removed the torn shirt, revealing a plain undershirt beneath. He handed the garment to Eleanor, who felt a strange flutter in her chest at this unexpected interaction. She gestured for him to wait and turned to inspect the tear. It was a simple repair, taking only minutes. As she worked, she sensed his eyes on her, but it wasn't the intrusive scrutiny she often felt. It was curiosity, perhaps even admiration. When she finished, she returned the shirt. He examined her work with careful fingers before nodding in approval. From his pocket he produced a few coins, but Eleanor shook her head and wrote, "No charge for a small repair." He frowned, clearly unwilling to accept charity. He placed the coins on the counter, then slowly signed, "Caleb Thornton, ranch north of town." Eleanor responded with her name, both signing and writing it. Caleb studied her face, then signed something she didn't catch. Seeing her confusion, he pointed to the slate, and she handed it over. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant as he wrote, "You read lips." Eleanor shook her head and wrote, "I can speak, but illness took most of my voice. I learned some hand signs." Caleb read her words, then looked up with an expression that hit Eleanor like a physical force. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding, the gaze of someone who knew what it was to navigate a world not built for him. He wrote on the slate, "Come to supper at my ranch Sunday. I'll send a wagon." The invitation was so sudden that Eleanor could only stare. Caleb tapped the slate, his expression questioning, awaiting her reply. Before she could respond, the shop door opened, and Margaret returned with James Caldwell in tow. James froze at the sight of a shirtless man at the counter with Eleanor. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Caleb, oblivious to the question, calmly donned his repaired shirt. James stepped forward, positioning himself between Eleanor and Caleb. "Thornton, what are you doing bothering Miss Harper?" Caleb, sensing James's aggressive stance, frowned in confusion. Margaret quickly intervened. "Mr. Thornton needed a shirt mended, James." Nothing untoward happened. James turned to Eleanor. "Is that true, or is this deaf fellow troubling you?" The contempt in his voice when he said deaf ignited Eleanor's anger. She seized her slate and wrote in bold, clear letters, "Mr. Thornton is a perfect gentleman. Unlike some in this town." James's face reddened as he read her words. "I see you found a kindred spirit in the town's eccentric," he sneered. "How fitting." Caleb, closely watching their faces, seemed to grasp the tension despite not hearing the words. He stood taller, a few inches above James, and fixed him with a steely gaze that made the smaller man step back. Margaret moved between them. "That's enough, James. You've said your piece. Now I suggest you place an order or leave." After James stormed out, Margaret turned to Eleanor with concern. "Be careful with Caleb Thornton, dear. He's a good man, but he lives alone for a reason. Folks here don't understand him, and they won't take kindly to you spending time with him." Eleanor glanced at Caleb, who was studying them intently, trying to follow the conversation through their expressions. Something in his steady gaze made her feel seen for the first time since arriving in Willow Creek. She picked up her slate and wrote her reply to his earlier invitation, "Sunday supper." "Yes." Caleb's smile broke across his face like dawn over the Montana plains, warm, genuine, and full of promise. In that moment, Eleanor knew her journey to this remote frontier town might hold a purpose she hadn't dared imagine. Chapter 3: A Journey to the Ranch. Sunday arrived with a crisp, clear sky, a rarity for early March in Montana territory, where the winds often carried the bite of winter well into spring. Eleanor Harper stood on the porch of Abigail Thornton's boarding house, dressed in her second-best gown, a practical navy wool dress she had altered the night before to reflect the simpler, sturdier styles she'd observed among Willow Creek's women. The intricate lace and bustles of her Philadelphia wardrobe felt out of place here, where utility trumped ornamentation. "You look lovely, dear," Abigail said, stepping out to join her. "Though I still think this outing is hasty." "You scarcely know Caleb Thornton." Eleanor retrieved her slate and wrote, "I feel at ease with him. We understand each other." Abigail sighed. "Perhaps so, but Caleb's ranch is 5 miles out. His nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, are another mile off. If you need help, I'll be fine," Eleanor wrote. "Mr. Thornton has been nothing but respectful." "It's not just that." Abigail lowered her voice, her tone cautious. "Caleb's lived alone since his father passed 3 years ago. Before that, it was just the two of them since he was a boy. He wasn't raised around women, and with his condition," Eleanor frowned and wrote, "his deafness doesn't make him dangerous." "Of course not," Abigail corrected quickly. "But he's isolated himself. Folks say he's gone half wild, living out there with only wolves and cattle for company." The clatter of wagon wheels on the dirt road interrupted them. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she saw Caleb Thornton guiding a well-maintained buckboard pulled by 2 chestnut mares. What struck her immediately was his transformation. Gone were the work-worn clothes from their first meeting. Today, Caleb wore a clean white shirt beneath a dark vest, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He looked almost handsome in a rugged, weathered way, his broad frame speaking of years spent wrestling the land into submission. As the wagon rolled to a stop, Eleanor descended the porch steps. Caleb leapt down, offering a small, hesitant smile. In his hands was a humble bouquet of early spring wildflowers, columbines and lupines, their delicate petals a stark contrast to his calloused fingers. Abigail followed Eleanor down. "Mr. Thornton," she called loudly, then caught herself and nodded instead. Caleb returned the nod before focusing on Eleanor. He presented the flowers with a formal bow, as if he'd rehearsed the gesture. Eleanor accepted them with a genuine smile, her eyes conveying gratitude. Caleb pointed to his wrist, where a watch might sit, then to the sky, signaling they should depart. After helping Eleanor onto the wagon's bench, he exchanged a look with Abigail, a silent promise to care for her guest. "Have her back before dark, you hear," Abigail called, exaggerating her gestures. Caleb nodded solemnly before climbing beside Eleanor. As they rolled out of Willow Creek, the town's clapboard buildings gave way to open prairies dotted with sagebrush and the first blooms of spring. Eleanor felt a rush of freedom, the vastness of the landscape mirroring the possibilities she hadn't dared imagine. The space between them on the bench was close enough for her to sense the warmth of Caleb's solid frame, yet he was careful not to crowd her. Eleanor wrote on her slate, "Thank you for the invitation." Caleb glanced at her words, then signed something before recalling she didn't know his gestures. He took the slate and wrote, "Thank you for accepting." Not many would. The simple honesty of his words touched Eleanor deeply. In a few strokes of chalk, he acknowledged their shared status as outsiders. The road climbed gently into rolling hills cloaked in ponderosa pines. Around a bend, Caleb's ranch came into view, nestled in a sheltered valley. A sturdy log house stood at its heart, surrounded by a barn, corrals, and a few outbuildings. A creek wound through the property, its waters glinting in the midday sun, and Eleanor could see cattle grazing on the tender spring grass. This was no grand cattle baron's estate, but neither was it the crude shack she'd feared. The house was larger than she'd expected, its glass windows catching the light and a stone chimney trailing a wisp of smoke. Caleb halted the wagon before the house and helped Eleanor down. She noticed his hands, rough but clean, his grip firm yet gentle. Up close, she caught the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes and a hint of nervousness in his expression, mirroring her own. He led her onto the porch and opened the door. The interior surprised her. It was simple but welcoming and remarkably clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, with handcrafted wooden furniture arranged for conversation. A bookshelf lined one wall, a rarity in a ranch house, especially for a deaf man. Caleb gestured for her to make herself comfortable, while he disappeared into what must be the kitchen. Eleanor wandered to the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of books ranging from practical guides on animal husbandry to classics like Moby Dick and the Scarlet Letter. Many were worn, well-read. She was examining a volume of Whitman's poetry when Caleb returned with 2 glasses of lemonade. He saw her with the book, a question in his eyes. Eleanor accepted the glass and wrote, "You enjoy poetry." Caleb set his glass down to free his hands. He took the slate and wrote, "My father taught me to read young. Books became my window to the world of sound." Eleanor nodded, understanding. For her, writing had become her voice when speech failed. "How long have you been deaf?" she wrote. "Since birth," he replied. "Never heard a sound." The revelation startled her. Caleb carried himself with such awareness of his surroundings that she'd assumed his deafness came later in life. "How do you manage the ranch alone?" she asked. His expression brightened. He beckoned her to a window, pointing to a young man working with horses in the corral. "Jacob Henderson, neighbor's son, works for me 3 days a week. Today's special." He paused, then added, "Ranch was my grandfather's, then my father's, now mine. 25 cattle, 12 horses, 100 acres. Pride shone in his written words, the satisfaction of a man who had preserved a family legacy against the odds. Chapter 4, A Shared Silence. Later, Caleb led her to the kitchen, where a table was set for dinner. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, its savory aroma filling the air. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, impressed. Reading her unspoken question, Caleb wrote, "I cook. My father taught me. Not fancy but good." And it was. The stew was hearty, with tender beef, potatoes, carrots, and herbs blended in perfect harmony. Freshly baked cornbread, clearly made that morning, accompanied the meal. Eleanor hadn't expected such domestic care from a bachelor, especially one so isolated. As they ate, they developed a rhythm of communication, passing the slate back and forth, with Eleanor occasionally whispering words that Caleb followed by watching her lips. It was a slow, deliberate conversation, yet somehow more meaningful than the idle chatter she'd endured at Philadelphia socials. Caleb wrote of his daily life, rising before dawn to tend livestock, the seasonal cycles of ranch work, quiet evenings reading by the fire. Eleanor shared stories of Philadelphia, her apprenticeship in her father's tailoring shop, and her love for creating beauty from fabric and thread. Neither directly addressed their disabilities, but they hovered in the background of each exchange, not as barriers, but as the reason they could relate to each other's isolation. After dinner, Caleb suggested showing Eleanor the rest of the property. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked from the barn to the creek, Caleb pointing out his projects and plans for the ranch. His ambitions were modest but clear. Expand the herd gradually, improve breeding stock, perhaps plant an orchard near the house. At the barn, Jacob Henderson tipped his hat to Eleanor, his friendly smile free of the wariness she often encountered in town. "Miss Harper," he greeted. "Caleb's been looking forward to your visit all week." "Cleaned the house twice." Eleanor smiled at the revelation, glancing at Caleb, who was focused on adjusting a harness and missed the exchange. "He's a good man," Jacob continued, lowering his voice. "Folks in town don't give him enough credit. Smartest rancher in the county, if you ask me. Got breeding methods others are just catching on to." Eleanor nodded, wishing she could respond more fully. She wrote, "He seems very capable." "More than capable," Jacob affirmed. "My pa says if Caleb could hear, he'd run the biggest spread in the territory. As is, he does more with 100 acres than others do with 500. Caleb returned from the horse, catching them talking. His expression held mild curiosity, but no suspicion. Eleanor realized Caleb trusted Jacob, a rare luxury for those with disabilities in a world quick to exploit perceived weaknesses. As dusk approached, they returned to the house. Caleb kindled a fire to ward off the evening chill and offered coffee. While he prepared it, Eleanor noticed a small table in the corner, cluttered with tools and what looked like clock mechanisms in various stages of repair. When Caleb returned, she pointed to the table with a questioning look. "I fix clocks and watches," he wrote. "Townsfolk bring them to me. Good work for winter evenings." Eleanor approached the table to examine his work closely. The precision of the tiny gears and springs, meticulously arranged, spoke of extraordinary patience and attention to detail. "This is remarkable," she wrote. "How did you learn?" "My father had a broken pocket watch. No money to fix it. I taught myself from a book." Eleanor marveled at the revelation. The man before her had overcome not just deafness, but the prejudices and limitations others imposed, through sheer determination and ingenuity. As the light began to fade, Caleb reluctantly wrote that they should return to town. Abigail's warning about being back before dark hung unspoken between them. The ride back was quiet, both lost in thought as the wagon rolled along the darkening road. Eleanor found herself wishing the ranch were closer, that their day didn't have to end so soon. At the boarding house, Caleb helped her down, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. In the golden light from the boarding house windows, his face held a mix of hope and resignation. He took her slate and wrote, "Thank you for coming. Best day in a long time." Eleanor read his words, warmth spreading through her chest. She took back the slate and wrote, "When can I see you again?" Caleb's smile was answer enough, but he wrote, "Market day Thursday. Meet at noon." Eleanor nodded, then on impulse reached out and squeezed his hand. The simple gesture conveyed what her faint voice or chalk couldn't fully express: connection, gratitude, understanding. From the porch, Abigail cleared her throat pointedly. Caleb stepped back, tipping his hat to both women before climbing onto the wagon. As he drove off, Eleanor watched until the darkness swallowed the wagon and the man within it. "Well," Abigail said, her tone carefully neutral. "I see you made it back safe." Eleanor nodded, her mind still at the ranch, with its bookshelves, clocks, and the man who had built a life of dignity despite the world's disdain. "Was it pleasant?" Abigail asked, curiosity softening her earlier reserve. Eleanor wrote, "Very pleasant. He's kind and intelligent." Abigail studied Eleanor's face. "You're glowing, child. I haven't seen you look so alive since you arrived." Over tea inside, Abigail's questions continued, each answered patiently by Eleanor's chalk. Yes, his house was clean and well kept. No, he wasn't improper in any way. Yes, he cooked the meal himself. Remarkable, Abigail murmured. Though I suppose when you live alone like he does, you learn to manage. Before bed, Eleanor wrote one final message. I'll see him again Thursday. Abigail's eyebrows rose, but she didn't object. Just be cautious, Eleanor. Not with Caleb. I trust your judgment that he's honorable, but this town can be cruel to those who don't fit its narrow expectations. They are already whispering about the mute lady from the east. If you align with the deaf rancher, those whispers will grow louder. Eleanor squared her shoulders and wrote firmly, let them whisper. I've heard worse in Philadelphia's drawing rooms. That night, Eleanor dreamed not of Philadelphia's cobblestone streets or the life she'd left behind, but of Montana's boundless skies and a ranch house filled with books. In her dream, she and Caleb sat by the fire, communicating effortlessly without slate or signs, only an understanding that flowed between them like the creek through his land. She awoke before dawn, restless with new possibilities. For the first time since the fever stole her family and voice, Eleanor felt the stirrings of something akin to hope, not just for survival, but for a life of meaning. Chapter 5. Market Day in a Stand. The week dragged slowly, each day at Margaret's shop stretching endlessly. As Eleanor anticipated Thursday's meeting, she caught herself glancing at the door whenever the bell jingled, hoping for Caleb, though she knew he rarely came to town except on market days. Margaret noticed her distraction when Eleanor pricked her finger for the third time while hemming a dress. You're smitten, aren't you? The seamstress teased with a knowing smile. Eleanor blushed, shaking her head in denial. Don't play coy with me, girl. I've seen that look before, Margaret said, sitting beside her. Abigail told me about your Sunday adventure. Said you came back happier than she's ever seen you. Eleanor focused on her stitching, avoiding Margaret's gaze. I think it's wonderful, Margaret continued, surprising her. This town needs more folks willing to look beyond appearances. And Caleb Thornton deserves happiness. That man's endured more hardship than most. Eleanor looked up, curious. You didn't know, Margaret said. His mother died giving birth to him. Some said that caused his deafness, though doctors now call that nonsense. His father raised him alone, taught him to lip read and sign. Then, when Caleb was 12, a horse kicked his father in the head. Didn't kill him outright, but he was never the same. Caleb cared for him nearly 20 years until he passed. The new information gave Eleanor pause. She'd sensed a deep strength in Caleb, but hadn't grasped its roots. His self-reliance wasn't just about adapting to deafness. It was forged from necessity, from responsibilities shouldered too young. That ranch should have failed a dozen times, Margaret went on. But somehow, Caleb kept it going, even when drought wiped out half the county's herds 2 summers ago. He's got a way with animals, like they understand him better than people do. When Thursday finally arrived, Eleanor dressed carefully in a green calico dress she'd sewn herself, its bone buttons contrasting with her chestnut hair. At noon, she stood outside the general store, her heart pounding like a Mustang breaking free. The market day crowd bustled around her. Farmers with produce, ranchers with goods to trade, townsfolk seizing the weekly gathering to socialize. Eleanor stood apart, scanning for Caleb among the strangers. The store's clock read 12:30, and still no sign of him. She shifted nervously, ignoring curious glances from passers-by. Perhaps he'd changed his mind. Or worse, something had happened at the ranch, an accident no one could hear him call for help. Just as anxiety tightened her chest, Eleanor spotted James Caldwell approaching. His smile lacked the warmth she'd seen in Caleb's eyes. Miss Harper, he greeted with exaggerated enunciation, as if her vocal issue affected her hearing. Waiting for someone. Eleanor nodded noncommittally, hoping he'd move on. If you're expecting Thornton, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed, James said with a hint of satisfaction. Sheriff Dawson detained him at the livery. Seems there's a mix-up over feed payments. Alarm flashed through Eleanor. She reached for her slate, but James pressed on before she could write. Such a shame, the challenges of doing business without proper communication. He shook his head with feigned sympathy. Perhaps this shows why some arrangements are unwise. Eleanor's chalk nearly snapped as she wrote, "Where's the livery?" James's smile faltered. "Miss Harper, this isn't a matter for a lady to meddle in. The sheriff will handle it." She brushed past him, clutching her slate, and headed toward the end of the main street where she recalled seeing the livery. James called after her, but she didn't look back. The scene at the livery made her blood boil. Caleb stood amid a small crowd, his usual confident posture strained with frustration. Sheriff Dawson, a stocky man with a bushy mustache, was speaking loudly and slowly, exaggerating his lip movements in a near-mocking way. "I said, do you have a receipt?" the sheriff bellowed. Caleb's hands moved rapidly in signs Eleanor didn't understand, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. The livery owner, a wiry man with stooped shoulders, stood to the side, shaking his head. "I told him last month the price went up. Ain't my fault if he didn't get it." Eleanor pushed through the crowd until she stood beside Caleb. His eyes widened in surprise, then softened with relief at seeing her. She wrote quickly, "What happened?" Caleb took the slate, scribbling, "Price changed. Livery says I owe more. Paid what was agreed." Eleanor turned to face the sheriff and livery owner. She wrote on her slate and held it up for all to see, "Mr. Thornton can't hear your shouting." "What exactly is the dispute?" The sheriff glanced at her words with clear irritation. "This ain't your concern, ma'am." The livery owner was more forthcoming. "Thornton's got an account for horse feed. Price went up 2 cents a pound last month due to railroad costs. I posted a notice right there." He pointed to a tattered paper tacked by the entrance. "He owes me $3 from the last delivery." Eleanor looked at Caleb, who was watching the exchange intently, trying to follow through expressions and gestures. She could see the frustration in his clenched jaw. She wrote and showed Caleb, "Did you know about the price increase?" He shook his head firmly, then took the slate. "Would have paid if I knew. Never saw the notice." Of course he hadn't. A written notice only worked if someone pointed it out, or if he happened to look directly at it. Eleanor wrote a longer message and handed it to the sheriff and livery owner. Mr. Thornton didn't know of the price increase. A written notice isn't enough for someone who can't hear verbal announcements. He's always paid his debts, and will cover the difference now if you state the exact amount. The sheriff read her words aloud, his tone grudging. "All right, Jenkins, what's the exact amount?" The livery owner hesitated, then muttered, $3.24. Caleb, who had been carefully watching their lips, immediately pulled the exact amount from his pocket. He handed it to Jenkins, with a dignity that made Eleanor's heart ache. The sheriff shrugged. "Looks like this is settled." Then, to the dispersing crowd, "Show's over, folks. Get back to your business." As the crowd thinned, Eleanor noticed James Caldwell lingering at the edges, his face etched with disappointment. She had no doubt he'd played a role in this public humiliation. Caleb gently touched her arm to get her attention. When she met his gaze, he signed "Thank you," one of the few gestures she recognized. His eyes conveyed a gratitude words couldn't capture. She smiled and wrote, "Still time for lunch." His answering smile erased the last traces of tension from his face. They walked to a small cafe at the town's edge, away from the market's prying eyes. The proprietress, Mrs. Larson, greeted them with a warm, judgment-free smile. "Take any table you like," she said to Eleanor, then nodded respectfully to Caleb. "Good to see you again, Mr. Thornton." Over steaming bowls of soup and fresh bread, they passed the slate back and forth. Caleb explained that the sheriff had intercepted him as soon as he reached town. "Should have expected trouble," he wrote. "James Caldwell never forgave me for outbidding him at the Thompson cattle auction last fall." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, curious. "He wanted to expand his investments," Caleb explained. "Thought ranching was easy money. Got mad when the deaf man got the better herd." As they ate, Eleanor noticed Caleb's keen awareness of his surroundings, his eyes constantly scanning the room. She realized he compensated for his deafness with heightened visual vigilance. Nothing escaped his notice. "You read people well," she wrote. Caleb nodded. "Have to survive. People say more with faces and bodies than words." The insight struck Eleanor deeply. She, too, had learned to read subtle shifts in expression, the micro-insults hidden behind polite smiles. Their disabilities had granted them parallel perceptions through different paths. "I brought something for you," Caleb wrote, pulling a small package from his coat. Wrapped in brown paper and twine was a thin book, a manual of sign language for the deaf. Its pages were soft from years of use. "My father's," Caleb explained. "Thought you might want to learn more signs. Easier than writing everything." Eleanor was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She opened the book, flipping through pages illustrated with hand positions and meanings. "I want to learn," she wrote, then hesitated before attempting the thank you sign she'd seen him use. Caleb's face lit up. He gently adjusted her fingers, his touch light but firm. The moment of connection lingered, a bridge built from shared understanding. After lunch, they strolled through the market. Caleb purchased supplies for the ranch, introducing Eleanor to trusted vendors with simple gestures and written notes. She observed how some treated him with respect, patiently communicating in unconventional ways, while others spoke to him as if he were a child, or worse, addressed only Eleanor as if Caleb weren't there. Through it all, he maintained a calm dignity Eleanor admired. The livery humiliation had frustrated, but not surprised him. Just another day navigating a world designed for the hearing. At the general store, James Caldwell watched them pass with undisguised displeasure. When Caleb stepped away to inspect tools in another aisle, James approached Eleanor. "I see you've become the guardian of our local oddity," he said softly. "Is this some Eastern charity misstep, Miss Harper? Or do you think damaged goods belong together?" The cruelty in his words stung. But Eleanor had endured worse in Philadelphia salons. She wrote, "Mr. Thornton is a finer gentleman than many who hear and speak perfectly." James's face flushed. "You're making a fool of yourself. First arriving as a mail-order bride, then rejected, and now consorting with a deaf rancher." "People are talking," Eleanor shrugged and wrote, "Let them. Their opinions don't matter to me." "They should," James hissed. "A lone woman can't ignore society's judgment. You have no protector, no family. Reputation is all you have." The truth in his words cut deeper than she cared to admit. She was indeed alone, her future uncertain, but bowing to Willow Creek's petty prejudices was too high a price for security. Before she could reply, Caleb returned, instantly sensing the tension. He looked between Eleanor and James, his expression questioning. James switched to a false smile. "Mr. Thornton," he said, exaggerating his lip movements. "Just a friendly chat with Miss Harper." "Good day to you both." He retreated to the counter where customers waited. Outside, under the spring sun, Caleb took the slate. What did he say to upset you? Eleanor hesitated, then wrote, "He thinks we shouldn't be friends because of our differences." Caleb's jaw tightened, but his response surprised her. He may be right. Your life would be easier without the complications I bring. The selflessness in his concern touched Eleanor deeply. She wrote firmly, "I'm tired of easy paths that lead nowhere. I prefer difficult journeys with worthy companions." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a wall crumbling, cautious hope rising. He offered his arm, and she took it, aware of the statement they made. Walking arm in arm down Willow Creek's Main Street, they reached Abigail's boarding house all too soon. On the porch, away from curious eyes, Caleb took Eleanor's slate one last time. "Can I see you again? Sunday supper?" She nodded, then impulsively reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers saying what her voice and chalk couldn't fully convey. Caleb caught her hand, pressing it gently to his face for a moment before reluctantly letting go. As he walked away, Eleanor clutched the sign language book to her chest, already planning to study it before their next meeting. Abigail was waiting in the parlor, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "I heard about the livery kerfuffle," she said. "Half the town's talking about you rushing to Caleb Thornton's defense." Eleanor nodded, unapologetic. "James Caldwell stopped by earlier," Abigail continued, looking mighty perturbed. "Said you're harming yourself by associating with Caleb." Eleanor's eyes flashed as she wrote, "James Caldwell orchestrated the whole thing to humiliate Caleb. He's a petty, cruel man." Abigail sighed. "I don't dispute your assessment of James, but Eleanor, you must consider your position. You're still building a life here. Making enemies of influential townsfolk is risky. So is abandoning someone because they are different," Eleanor wrote. "I won't do that." "Not again." The words slipped out before she could reconsider. Abigail's eyebrows rose. "Again? There's a story here, I reckon." Eleanor hesitated, then wrote slowly, "After my illness, friends drifted away. Conversation became too hard. Invitations stopped. My fiancé returned my ring, with a note saying he couldn't face a lifetime of silence." Abigail's expression softened. "Oh, my dear, no wonder you understand Caleb's isolation. You speak the same language," Eleanor wrote, "the language of patience and perseverance." Over the next 2 days, Eleanor threw herself into studying the sign language book. Her nimble fingers, accustomed to intricate needlework, quickly adapted to the precise movements. She practiced between customers at Margaret's shop, during meals, and late into the night by candlelight. Margaret caught her signing to herself while sorting buttons on Saturday afternoon. "Well, look at you," she said approvingly. "That's a far better solution than that slate you're always toting." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the encouragement, and wrote, "I want to surprise Caleb tomorrow. Show him I'm trying to learn his language." "That man's already smitten," Margaret chuckled. "This'll knock him flat." On Sunday, Jacob Henderson arrived with the wagon instead of Caleb. "He's got a bad cut," Jacob explained. "Not serious, but he wanted me to fetch you if you're still willing to come. Said he'd understand if you didn't." Eleanor grabbed her reticule and shawl without hesitation, much to Abigail's dismay. "Alone at his ranch when he's injured," Abigail fretted. "It's not proper," Jacob interjected. "My ma's there. She came to help with cooking and such. She can chaperone." The assurance eased Abigail somewhat, though she insisted Eleanor return before dark. The ride to the ranch felt quicker this time, Eleanor's anticipation growing with each mile. When they arrived, Jacob led her inside, where she found Caleb seated by the fire, his left arm bandaged and in a sling. His face lit up at seeing her, though embarrassment quickly followed. caught his hand on a broken fence post. A plump woman with a friendly face, Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor presumed, explained. Men and their stubborn pride. Wouldn't see a doctor till the whole fence was fixed. Took 7 stitches. Caleb winced at Mrs. Henderson's account, though he couldn't hear her words, clearly understanding she was discussing his injury from her gesture toward his arm. Mrs. Henderson addressed Eleanor directly. You must be Miss Harper. I'm Clara Henderson. Caleb's told us plenty about you, or rather written plenty. She smiled warmly. I'll be in the kitchen finishing supper. Jacob'll help with the afternoon chores. As they left, leaving Eleanor and Caleb alone in the main room, an awkward silence settled. Caleb seemed self-conscious about his injury, as if he'd let her down by not being at his best. Eleanor set down her reticule, removed her shawl and bonnet. Then, instead of reaching for her slate, she raised her hands and carefully signed, I've been practicing. Caleb's expression shifted from surprise to awe. He sat up straighter, signing, You learned for me. She nodded, signing carefully, Your book helped. Still learning. Slow. The joy on his face made every hour of practice worthwhile. He signed slowly, This means more than you know. For the next hour, they conversed in their new shared language, Eleanor frequently consulting the book she'd brought. Caleb patiently corrected her hand positions when needed. It was halting and imperfect, but infinitely more intimate than passing a slate. When Mrs. Henderson called them to supper, Eleanor was startled to realize how quickly time had passed. Supper was lively, with Mrs. Henderson filling the silence with cheerful stories of local gossip, while Eleanor and Caleb communicated through a mix of signs, facial expressions, and written notes. It's remarkable, Mrs. Henderson observed, watching them. I've known Caleb since he was a boy, and I've never seen him communicate so easily with anyone but his father. After supper, despite Caleb's protests, Mrs. Henderson insisted on cleaning up herself. You two go sit by the fire. That arm needs rest, Caleb Thornton, and I won't hear arguments. In the fading afternoon light, they returned to the main room, where Caleb carefully added logs to the fire. As they settled, the reality of their growing connection hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Eleanor felt a quiet certainty that this ranch, this man, might be the home she'd crossed a continent to find. Chapter 6. A Language of Their Own. The days following Eleanor Harper's second visit to Caleb Thornton's ranch were a blur of anticipation and diligence. Each morning, she arrived at Margaret Hayes's seamstress shop with renewed purpose, her fingers deftly stitching while her mind wandered to the sign language book she studied by lamplight each night. The manual, worn from years of use by Caleb's father, was more than a tool. It was a bridge to a world where silence was not a barrier but a shared sanctuary. Eleanor practiced tirelessly, her hands learning to dance with the precision of her needlework, forming signs for home, friend, hope. She imagined surprising Caleb with a full sentence, a gesture that would say what her whispers could not, that she saw him, not as the town's outcast, but as a man of quiet strength and profound worth. In the shop, Margaret noticed the change in Eleanor's demeanor. You're practically glowing, she teased one afternoon as Eleanor fumbled a seam, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Don't tell me you're not counting the hours until Sunday. Eleanor blushed, scribbling on her slate. I'm just eager to practice my signing. Margaret laughed, her eyes twinkling. Practice is it. Well, I reckon Caleb Thornton's never had a pupil so dedicated. You're learning his language, and I'd wager he's learning yours. The town, however, was less charmed by the budding connection. Whispers followed Eleanor as she moved through Willow Creek's muddy streets, carrying bolts of fabric or delivering finished garments. The mute lady and the deaf rancher, she overheard a shopkeeper murmur to a customer. A peculiar pair, if you ask me. At the general store, a matronly woman buying calico shot Eleanor a pitying glance, muttering to her companion, "Poor thing, settling for a man who can't even hear her." Eleanor held her head high, her slate tucked firmly under her arm. She had endured Philadelphia's drawing rooms, where veiled insults masqueraded as concern. Willow Creek's gossip was no sharper. Yet the weight of their judgment lingered, a reminder of her precarious place in this frontier world. Thursday's market day had planted a seed of defiance in Eleanor. James Caldwell's attempt to humiliate Caleb at the livery had backfired, but it revealed the depth of his influence and his spite. Eleanor suspected he wasn't finished. When she confided her concerns to Abigail at the boarding house, the older woman nodded grimly. "James has a knack for stirring trouble," Abigail said, stirring a pot of stew. "He's got half the town believing he's their benefactor, with his store credit and church donations. But mark my words, his charity comes with strings." Eleanor wrote, "He wants to control everyone, doesn't he?" Abigail's eyes narrowed. Control, and to be seen controlling. Caleb's independence threatens that. And you, my dear, are a complication he didn't expect. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. When Jacob Henderson's wagon rolled up to the boarding house, Eleanor was ready, her green calico dress freshly pressed, the sign language book tucked into her reticule. Abigail stood on the porch, her expression a mix of maternal worry and reluctant approval. "Mind yourself out there," she called as Eleanor climbed aboard. "And don't let that Thornton boy keep you past dusk." Eleanor smiled, signing thank you, a gesture Abigail had begun to recognize from her own tentative study of Caleb's book. The ride to the ranch was filled with the scent of sagebrush and the distant lowing of cattle, a symphony of the frontier that Eleanor was beginning to love. Jacob chatted amiably, sharing tidbits about the ranch. "Caleb's been fussing over the place all week," he said, grinning. "Even polished the silverware, and I ain't never seen him do that." Eleanor's heart warmed at the thought of Caleb preparing for her visit, his quiet care a stark contrast to James Caldwell's calculated gestures. At the ranch, Clara Henderson greeted her at the door, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Come in, come in." Caleb's just out back, tending to a calf that got tangled in some wire. "He'll be along shortly." Inside, the house was as welcoming as Eleanor remembered, the fireplace crackling, the air fragrant with roasting meat. Caleb appeared moments later, his bandaged arm still in a sling but his smile as bright as the Montana sun. He signed hello, then hesitated, his eyes searching hers as if to gauge her mood. Eleanor responded with a careful "good to see you," her hands trembling slightly with the effort to get it right. Caleb's grin widened, and he signed "you're getting good," his fingers moving slowly for her benefit. Dinner was a warm, communal affair, with Clara Henderson regaling them with tales of Willow Creek's early days, tales of blizzards that buried cattle, barn dances that lasted till dawn, and the time a traveling preacher mistook a saloon for a church. Eleanor and Caleb communicated through a blend of signs and slate, their exchanges growing smoother with each passing minute. Clara watched with evident delight. "You two are a sight," she said, passing a basket of cornbread. "It's like you've got your own secret language." Eleanor wrote, "It feels like that sometimes." Caleb read her words and signed "It's our language," his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. After dinner, Clara shooed them to the parlor while she and Jacob tidied up. Alone by the fire, Eleanor and Caleb settled into a comfortable rhythm, their conversation flowing through signs, occasional whispers, and the ever-present slate. Eleanor shared memories of Philadelphia's bustling markets, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, and the quiet joy of sewing by her mother's side. Caleb wrote of his father's stories, tales of crossing the Oregon Trail, of building this ranch from nothing but grit and hope. Their disabilities, though unmentioned, were the undercurrent of their connection, the reason they could sit in silence without discomfort, understanding the weight of being unseen in a world that demanded conformity. As the afternoon waned, Caleb suggested a short walk to the creek, his arm sling no deterrent to his eagerness to share his world. The prairie stretched endless before them, the mountains a distant, jagged silhouette against the sky. Caleb pointed out a new fence line he planned to extend, his signs animated with pride. Eleanor signed "It's beautiful," then added on her slate, "You've built something extraordinary here." Caleb's expression softened, and he wrote, "It's home. But it's been lonely. Until now." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Eleanor felt a surge of courage and signed, "I'm glad I came to Willow Creek." Caleb's eyes searched hers, then he signed slowly, "I'm glad you stayed." The moment was fragile, a thread of connection that could either strengthen or snap under the weight of the world outside. Before either could say more, Clara called from the house, signaling it was time to return to town. The ride back was quieter than the journey out, Eleanor clutching the sign language book, her mind racing with the realization that she was falling for a man whose world was as silent as her own. At the boarding house, Caleb helped her down, his touch lingering. He wrote, "Next Sunday." Eleanor nodded, then signed yes, her hand steadier now. As he drove off, Abigail was waiting, her curiosity barely contained. "You're smitten," she said, not a question. Eleanor wrote, "He's different. He sees me." Abigail's expression softened. "That's a rare thing, child. Hold on to it. But be prepared, the town won't make it easy." Chapter 7, The Founders' Day Reckoning. The weeks that followed were a dance of stolen moments and growing trust. Eleanor and Caleb met each Sunday at the ranch, their conversations deepening as Eleanor's signing improved. She learned signs for dream, future together, each gesture a step closer to a shared vision. In town, she threw herself into her work at Margaret's shop, earning praise for her meticulous craftsmanship. But the whispers grew louder, fueled by James Caldwell's subtle machinations. He made a point of stopping by the shop, ostensibly to order shirts, but his comments were laced with venom. "You're wasting your talents on Thornton," he said one day, his voice low. "A woman like you could do better than a man who can't even hear his own name." Eleanor wrote, "I choose my company based on character, not convenience." James's smile was cold. "Character doesn't pay bills, Miss Harper." The tension came to a head at Willow Creek's Founders' Day celebration, a grand affair marking the town's establishment. The main square was transformed with bunting and lanterns, tables laden with pies, smoked meats, and jars of homemade preserves, a testament to the community's pride in its frontier roots. Eleanor arrived with Margaret and Abigail, wearing a new dress she'd sewn herself, a soft blue that caught the late summer light. Caleb joined them later, having driven in from the ranch, his presence drawing curious glances. He signed "You look beautiful," and Eleanor blushed, signing "thank you" with a confidence she hadn't possessed weeks before. The celebration began with speeches from the mayor, Samuel Bennett, and other town elders, extolling Willow Creek's progress, new businesses, a schoolhouse, plans for a telegraph line. Eleanor and Caleb stood at the edge of the crowd, their hands occasionally brushing as they signed to each other, a private conversation amid the public revelry. The mood shifted when James Caldwell took the stage, his polished demeanor commanding attention. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying over the square, "we gather to celebrate our town's growth, but we must also protect its future. I propose a new initiative, a sanctuary for those with severe afflictions, a place where they can be cared for properly, rather than burdening our community. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's stomach twisted as James's eyes flicked toward her and Caleb. "There are those among us," he continued, "whose conditions, while pitiable, hinder the progress of a town striving for respectability. A deaf rancher, a mute seamstress, their limitations, though no fault of their own, require specialized care we cannot provide here." Caleb's hand tightened on Eleanor's, his jaw set. She wrote frantically, "He's targeting us." Caleb nodded, his expression grim, and wrote, "He wants control. Always has." Before James could continue, a new voice cut through the murmurs. "If I may address this gathering," said a tall, silver-haired man stepping forward from the crowd. Eleanor's breath caught. It was Edward Langley, a family friend from Philadelphia who had tracked her to Willow Creek, concerned for her welfare. His presence was a shock, his tailored suit and cultured accent marking him as an outsider. "I am Edward Langley, a businessman from the East, and I have known Miss Harper since she was a child. She was raised in one of Philadelphia's finest families, educated and accomplished. Her vocal condition is the result of a tragic illness that took her parents and sister. Despite this, she managed her family's affairs with competence until choosing a new life here." Langley turned to Caleb, his tone respectful. "And though I've only recently met Mr. Thornton, I've observed his intelligence, dignity, and hard work. In Philadelphia's highest circles, we measure a person's worth by their character, not their physical abilities." He faced James directly. "Furthermore, Miss Harper has recently inherited a substantial sum through her father's investments. She remains in Willow Creek not out of necessity, but because she values the life and community she's found here, particularly the companionship of Mr. Thornton." Gasps and whispers spread through the crowd. Eleanor squeezed Caleb's hand, grateful for Langley's unexpected defense. James faltered, then rallied. "Wealth doesn't erase their limitations. A sanctuary would provide proper care." "Enough," Mayor Bennett interrupted, his tone firm. "Your proposal was made in what you claim is the town's best interest, Mr. Caldwell, but it seems Miss Harper and Mr. Thornton have arranged their own futures." He turned to the crowd. "This is a celebration of our progress. That progress must include recognizing that people overcome challenges in diverse ways. If Miss Harper and Mr. Thornton have found happiness together, who are we to interfere?" James's face darkened, but he stepped down, pushing through the crowd without meeting anyone's eyes. Eleanor felt a fleeting pity for him, a man so consumed by propriety that he couldn't see humanity in difference. As the musicians struck up a lively tune, signaling the start of the dance, Caleb signed, "Dance with me." Eleanor hesitated. "You can dance." His smile was mischievous. "My father taught me the steps. Said I didn't need to hear music to move with grace." He led her to the edge of the dance floor, where the vibrations from the fiddles were strongest. Placing her hand on his shoulder, he guided her into a simple waltz, his steps sure and steady. They weren't the most polished dancers in Willow Creek that night, but they were perhaps the most watched, not with pity, but with a dawning recognition that love and determination could transcend barriers most deemed insurmountable. As the evening ended, Caleb escorted Eleanor back to the boarding house. On the porch, shielded by the gathering dusk, he signed, "You didn't answer my question earlier." Eleanor tilted her head, puzzled. "About being my wife," he clarified, referring to a moment before James's speech, when he'd signed his intentions amid the chaos. The question, nearly lost in the day's events, now carried profound weight. Eleanor's hands moved with certainty. "Yes, I'd be honored to marry you." Caleb's smile lit his face, joy radiating from him like warmth from a hearth. From his pocket, he produced a small, worn box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a single pearl. "My mother's," he signed. "My father kept it for when I found someone to love." As he slipped it onto her finger, Eleanor felt the weight of history and promise, a bond not just to Caleb, but to the legacy he carried and the future they would forge. Chapter 8. A Wedding in the Valley. The news of Eleanor and Caleb's engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire across the prairie. By morning, Margaret greeted Eleanor with a fierce hug at the shop. "I knew it," she crowed. "I told Mrs. Larson last week you two would be official before summer's end." Eleanor signed. "We haven't set a date," her hands fluid with practice. "Whenever it is, you'll need a proper wedding dress, and don't you dare think of paying," Margaret declared. "It's my gift." Throughout the day, customers offered congratulations, some heartfelt, others tinged with curiosity. Mrs. Coleman, the banker's wife, paused while picking up a silk gown. "I'll admit I didn't understand at first," she said carefully. "But seeing you two dance, there's something special in how you communicate, something most couples never achieve." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the woman's sincerity and the town's growing acceptance. Not everyone was supportive. James Caldwell's wife entered the shop with barely concealed disdain, requesting alterations while pointedly ignoring Eleanor's assistance. The preacher's wife commented with an earshot about God's mysterious ways impairing the afflicted. But these voices were increasingly the minority. Something had shifted in Willow Creek's perception, a broadening of what constituted a worthy life and partnership. 3 days after Founder's Day, Caleb arrived at the shop near closing, his expression unusually grave. He waited until Margaret retreated to the back before approaching Eleanor. "We need to talk," he signed. "Can you come to the ranch Sunday?" Worry flickered in Eleanor's chest. "Is something wrong?" Caleb hesitated. "Not wrong. Important. About our future." The week crawled by, Eleanor's mind spinning with possibilities. Was Caleb reconsidering their engagement? Did he fear she couldn't adapt to ranch life? By Sunday morning, she was a bundle of nerves as she waited for Jacob Henderson's wagon. To her surprise, Caleb himself arrived, dressed impeccably in clean work clothes, his expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. The ride to the ranch passed in companionable silence, though Eleanor caught Caleb's stealing glances, as if reassuring himself of her presence. At the ranch, a surprise awaited. The Hendersons were there, along with Margaret and Abigail, all dressed in their Sunday best. "What's happening?" Eleanor signed, confusion etching her face. Caleb took her hand. "I realized something after Founder's Day. We don't need to wait or plan a grand wedding. If you're sure, if you're ready." Realization dawned. "Today." She signed, eyes wide. Caleb nodded. "Preacher Coleman's waiting inside. But only if you want. We can wait for a formal town wedding if you prefer." Eleanor glanced at the gathered friends, their faces alight with joyful anticipation. Abigail held a small valise, likely containing Eleanor's belongings, hinting at her complicity in the surprise. For a moment, Eleanor considered a traditional wedding, the preparations, the church ceremony, the inevitable whispers from those still skeptical of their union. Then she looked at Caleb, open, earnest, loving, and the home he'd built, ready to share with her. "No waiting," she signed firmly. "Today is perfect." Relief and joy transformed Caleb's face. He gestured toward the house. But before they moved, Eleanor held up a finger, asking for a moment. She turned to Abigail. "Can I have a few minutes to prepare?" she asked, her hoarse voice reserved for moments of importance. Abigail beamed. "Of course, dear. Margaret and I brought everything you might need. Come along, In the parlor, Eleanor found a simple but elegant white dress laid out on a chair, not the elaborate gown Margaret had planned, but a lovely creation clearly crafted with care in the past week. "We estimated your measurements from the dresses you've altered," Margaret explained as she helped Eleanor change. "Caleb came to me the day after Founders' Day with this plan. Said he saw no point in a fancy wedding when what mattered was building a life together." Abigail arranged Eleanor's hair with wildflowers Caleb had picked that morning. "That man loves you," she said, meeting Eleanor's eyes in a small mirror. "You know that, don't you?" Eleanor nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "It won't be easy," Abigail continued. "No marriage is. But you two understand struggle in a way most couples never will. That's your strength, not your weakness." When they emerged, the parlor had been transformed. Fresh wildflowers adorned every surface, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the small group. Preacher Coleman stood by the fireplace, Bible open, and Caleb waited, his expression shifting to awe as Eleanor appeared. The admiration in his eyes would have brought tears if she weren't so filled with joy. The ceremony was brief and unconventional. Caleb had written his vows, which Preacher Coleman read aloud while Caleb signed them for Eleanor. "I promise to build a life of equals, where our differences complement, not divide. I promise to see your silence not as absence, but as the space where deeper understanding lives. I promise to face the world's judgment with you, never forgetting that what others call our greatest weaknesses led to our greatest strength, each other." Eleanor's vows were signed directly to Caleb, with Abigail softly reading a translation for the others. "I promise to be your ears when needed, your voice when desired, but never to define you by what you cannot hear or me by what I cannot say. I promise to make a home where communication flows not just from lips and ears, but from heart to heart. I promise to stand beside you in dignity and resolve, every day grateful for the silence that brought us together." As Preacher Coleman pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb gently cupped Eleanor's face, his eyes conveying a devotion words could never fully capture. Their kiss was both a seal of their vows and a declaration to the world. They had found in each other's so-called limitations a freedom most would never know. The small celebration that followed was filled with laughter and conversation in multiple forms, spoken, signed, written, and the universal language of smiles and embraces. Clara Henderson had prepared a feast, and Jacob pulled out a fiddle, playing lively tunes while his father tried to teach Caleb and Eleanor a folk dance, ending in joyful chaos. As dusk settled over the ranch, the guests departed with hugs and well wishes, leaving the newlyweds alone in their shared home. The reality of the day seemed to settle over them as the door closed behind Abigail, the last to leave. "Wife," Caleb signed, the word carrying a sense of wonder. "Husband," Eleanor replied, equally amazed at the transformation a few hours had wrought. He took her hand, his expression turning serious. "Are you happy with this? Our small wedding, this modest home?" Eleanor looked around the ranch house that had first captivated her. The bookshelf brimming with worlds of knowledge, the clock repair table speaking of Caleb's precision and patience, the sturdy walls built through generations of Thorntons. Then she looked at Caleb, the man who saw her silence not as a flaw but as a soul kindred to his own quiet world. "This isn't a modest home," she signed, her movements fluid with emotion. "It's the richest home I've ever known." That night, as they stood on the porch watching stars emerge over Montana's vast sky, Caleb wrapped his arms around Eleanor from behind, his chin resting on her head. In the distance, a coyote's howl echoed through the darkened hills, a sound she could hear but he could only imagine. Yet they stood in the same moment, under the same stars, their hearts beating to rhythms neither fully heard but both deeply felt. Their perceptions of the world differed, yet complemented, uniting rather than dividing. Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, her hands rising between them to sign words no one else would witness. In Philadelphia, I was defined by what I lost. Here with you, I'm defined by what I found. Caleb's answering smile held the promise of all their tomorrows, days built not on perfect hearing or speech, but on perfect understanding. They had found in each other's silence the most eloquent language, unconditional acceptance, unreserved love, and the quiet miracle of being truly seen. Chapter 9. A Legacy Forged in Silence. 3 years later, the autumn sun bathed the expanded Thornton Ranch in golden light as Eleanor stood on the porch, watching Caleb demonstrate roping techniques to a group of eager ranch hands. Their holdings had nearly tripled, not out of ambition, but through a twist of fate that turned James Caldwell's schemes against him. After the Founders' Day confrontation, James had tried to turn the town against them, spreading rumors and meddling in their business. But Edward Langley, before returning east, had ensured Eleanor's inheritance was wisely invested, including the purchase of a struggling neighboring ranch when its owner decided to return to Ohio. With the added land, opportunities arose. Caleb's innovative cattle breeding techniques, once dismissed as the quirks of a deaf man, proved remarkably successful. Thornton Shorethorns became renowned across Montana territory for their resilience and quality. Eleanor, meanwhile, transformed the old ranch house on the new property into a small but thriving sewing school, teaching young women the fine needlework she'd brought from Philadelphia, adapted to the practical needs of the frontier. Laughter drew Eleanor's attention to the garden, where 4-year-old Clara Henderson was teaching 2-year-old Abigail Thornton signs for different flowers. Abigail, with her dark curls and hazel eyes like her father's, inherited the determination of both parents. Born with perfect hearing, confirmed by doctors through tests, and her startled reactions to dropped pans in infancy, Abigail lived in a household where silent communication flowed as naturally as speech. By her first birthday, her tiny hands formed simple signs, even as her spoken vocabulary grew typically. Jacob Henderson, now 22 and the ranch foreman, rode up to the barn, tipping his hat to Eleanor as he passed. His mother, Clara, followed in a wagon laden with jams and fresh bread. She had declared herself Abigail's unofficial grandmother, making the trek from their ranch twice weekly with food and affection. "Those men working out there must be famished," Clara called, halting the wagon. "Reckon we'll need extra for supper." Eleanor smiled and signed thank you, reserving her voice for moments of necessity. Over the years, her hoarse whisper had strengthened slightly, though it never regained its former clarity. But this no longer troubled her. In the world she and Caleb had built, multiple forms of communication coexisted, each valued for its purpose. "Any progress on the school expansion?" Clara asked, stepping down. Eleanor signed. "New wing will be done before first snow. We've confirmed 5 students for spring." The sewing school had begun with 2 local girls eager to learn a trade. Now, young women from as far as Bozeman sought Eleanor's mentorship, some boarding at the converted ranch house for months of training. Her blend of Eastern techniques and frontier practicality created a unique curriculum, producing graduates whose work was increasingly sought after across the territory. "And James Caldwell's daughter is still enrolled," Clara raised an eyebrow. Eleanor nodded. Rebecca Caldwell, James's 18-year-old daughter, had approached Eleanor after a church service 6 months earlier, requesting admission to the school with halting but determined signs she'd taught herself in secret. "Rebecca's truly gifted," Eleanor signed. "Her father doesn't know she's enrolled for spring." James had maintained his opposition to the Thorntons' growing influence, though his proposed sanctuary was permanently shelved after the town council unanimously rejected it. His general store had faltered when the railroad reached Willow Creek the previous year, bringing competition he hadn't anticipated. Inside the main house, now expanded with 2 additional rooms, Eleanor and Clara prepared supper while Abigail helped by arranging napkins with earnest concentration. The child moved seamlessly between silent and spoken worlds, signing with her mother while speaking to guests unfamiliar with their hand language. The sound of boots on the porch signaled the men's return. Caleb entered first, his face lighting up at the sight of his family. Abigail ran to him, arms outstretched, and he scooped her up in a fluid motion, her giggles filling the room as he spun her. "Look," she exclaimed, then switched to signs. "I set the napkins all by myself." Caleb's exaggerated surprise made her beam with pride. He set her down and crossed to Eleanor, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, their standard greeting, unchanged since their early days. Supper was a community affair with Jacob and Clara Henderson as regulars, joined tonight by Margaret, who, at 70, had retired from her shop, selling it to one of Eleanor's first students. Even Abigail Thornton visited monthly, bringing news from the boarding house she still ran with her niece's help. Conversation flowed through multiple channels: speech, signs, and past notes for complex topics. The boundaries between these modes had blurred over time, creating a hybrid language unique to their expanding circle. A few ranch hands had learned basic signs, finding them useful for communicating across noisy pastures or during cattle drives when voices didn't carry. After supper, as dusk painted the mountains in deep shadows, Jacob took up his fiddle. The vibrations through the wooden floor let Caleb feel the rhythm, if not the melody. He took Eleanor's hand, leading her into their familiar evening dance, a tradition born on their wedding night. Abigail watched from Clara's lap, clapping to a beat only some heard but all felt in their own way. After the guests departed, and Abigail was tucked into bed with a signed bedtime story from her father, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch swing, watching the first stars appear. "Do you ever imagine this life?" Caleb signed, his gestures illuminated by the hanging lantern. Eleanor smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Never. When I stepped off that train, I thought I'd reached the end of my journey, not the beginning." Caleb's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes I can't believe James's rejection led you to me. His greatest gift." Eleanor signed with a playful glint. "Speaking of James, did Abigail tell you?" "He's planning to sell the store and move to Denver." Caleb nodded. "Jacob heard from the blacksmith yesterday. Seems he's been offered a partnership in his brother's business. I hope he finds peace there." Eleanor signed, surprising herself with the sincerity. "You're too generous," Caleb replied, though his expression held admiration rather than reproach. "Not generous. Understanding. His limitations are greater than ours. He can't see beyond differences to what's possible." This philosophy had guided their approach to the community. Rather than retreating into isolation or fighting persistent prejudices, they lived authentically and openly, running a thriving ranch, raising a bilingual daughter, creating opportunities for others. Their most effective response to judgment was quiet excellence. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb signed, "Mayor Bennett approached me after church yesterday. Wants me to consider running for town council next term." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. From an outcast to a council member in 3 years was a remarkable shift. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That I'd discuss it with my wife," Caleb replied with a grin. "Meetings would need an interpreter." "I think you should do it," Eleanor signed decisively. "Your perspective is valuable, and it'll continue what we started at Founders Day, showing that difference doesn't mean lesser. The legacy of that confrontation had rippled through Willow Creek in unexpected ways. The new school now included provisions for teaching children with diverse challenges. The church reserved a front pew for those needing to see the preacher's lips clearly. Small adjustments appeared across town, not from pity, but from a recognition that community meant including everyone. From the nursery, a soft cry broke the night. Abigail, perhaps stirred by a dream, called for her parents. They rose together, accustomed to sharing parenthood's duties equally. In their daughter's room, Abigail's tiny hand signed sleepily, "Bad dream." Caleb sat on the bed's edge, while Eleanor smoothed Abigail's dark curls. Their daughter's ability to express needs in multiple ways, a blend of her parents' worlds, felt like a profound gift, not a compromise. "What did you dream?" Caleb signed. People couldn't talk to each other. Abigail signed back, her face serious. No one understood. Eleanor and Caleb exchanged a glance over her head, a look laden with shared history, understanding, and a touch of humor at the irony of her fear. "That's scary," Eleanor admitted. "But remember what we always tell you." Abigail's hands formed the familiar response. Listening isn't just with ears, and speaking isn't just with voices. Caleb added, completing their family mantra. As Abigail drifted back to sleep between them, Eleanor reflected on the journey to this moment. From a rejected mail-order bride, deemed too silent, to a woman who found strength in quietude and a voice in understanding. From a deaf rancher isolated by others' limitations, to a respected community member whose differences were increasingly valued. Their love story followed no conventional path. It was written in the spaces between words, in tangible and intangible gestures, in challenges overcome together. What James Caldwell and others saw as insurmountable barriers became the foundation of their extraordinary bond. Chapter 10: A Decade of Transformation. 10 years after Eleanor Harper stepped off the train in Willow Creek, the summer sun bathed the town's new city hall in a glow that matched its fresh paint and gleaming windows. The building stood as a testament to the prosperity that had transformed the humble frontier outpost into a thriving community. Banners and bunting fluttered in the breeze, heralding the day's significance. The 10th anniversary of the railroad's arrival and Willow Creek's official recognition as a city. Eleanor Thornton, now 38, adjusted the collar of her daughter Abigail's dress as they waited outside the city hall. Her chestnut hair, now threaded with silver at the temples, framed a face still bright with purpose. Beside her, 9-year-old Thomas Thornton fidgeted, his hazel eyes, his father's eyes, scanning the growing crowd for friends. "Hold still, young man," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now after years of careful practice, though still carrying its distinctive rasp. Thomas signed back with the fluency of a native signer, but paused about to speak. "I want a good spot." "Your father won't start without us," Abigail, 12, signed, her movements graceful and precise, reflecting her mother's elegance and her father's meticulousness. A decade of marriage had woven a rich tapestry for Eleanor, far beyond the fragile hopes she'd carried to Montana. The Thornton Ranch had grown into one of the region's most prosperous, renowned for Caleb's pioneering breeding techniques and sustainable grazing practices that drew ranchers from across the territory to observe. Eleanor's sewing school had evolved into the Thornton Institute of Practical Arts, a respected vocational school for young women, teaching not only needlework and design, but also business management, basic accounting, and communication skills. Graduates were sought after from Helena to Cheyenne, their work blending Eastern finesse with Western pragmatism. "Mrs. Thornton," a cheerful voice called from across the street. Rebecca Caldwell, now Rebecca Watson, after marrying the station master's son, hurried over, her young daughter trailing behind. At 28, Rebecca was one of the Institute's most successful alumni, running a thriving dress shop in Helena specializing in adaptive clothing for those with physical challenges. "I couldn't miss this," Rebecca said, embracing Eleanor warmly. "My father sent his regards, too." The news surprised Eleanor. James Caldwell had indeed moved to Denver years ago, his relationship with Rebecca strained by her choice to study under the woman he'd once scorned. His acknowledgement of today's event, however indirect, suggested a softening in his rigid worldview. Rebecca switched to signing as she addressed the Thornton family. "He's been following the newspaper reports about Pa's appointment. I think he's finally starting to understand." Caleb's appointment to the Montana Territory Education Commission had sent ripples through the region. No deaf person had ever held such a position of authority. His mandate was to develop standards ensuring all children, regardless of physical or sensory challenges, received a suitable education. The appointment followed years of steady community involvement. Caleb had joined the Willow Creek Town Council 8 years earlier, with Eleanor as his interpreter. His practical wisdom and creative problem-solving gradually won over even his staunchest critics. When the territorial governor visited Willow Creek 2 years prior and saw a community where sign language and speech coexisted seamlessly, he was inspired to create the new commission. The city hall doors opened, and the crowd began filing in. The Thornton family moved to the front row, reserved for speakers and their kin. Thomas bounced with excitement, while Abigail maintained a poised elegance that sometimes made her seem older than her years. Inside, the hall buzzed with chatter as townsfolk found seats. Many greeted the Thorntons with signs, a language that had spread through Willow Creek over the years, taught in schools and used in businesses. What had once marked Caleb and Eleanor as outsiders was now a community asset, bridging communication gaps in noisy sawmills, across sprawling pastures, and during church socials where music often drowned out speech. Mayor Samuel Bennett, now in his 60s with a full head of white hair, took the podium. He was among the first town officials to learn basic signs, recognizing their practical value beyond aiding one deaf resident. "Welcome, citizens of Willow Creek," he began, his hands forming signs simultaneously, a practice now standard in all official town functions. "Today, we celebrate not only our city's recognition, but the spirit that has shaped our community's growth." Eleanor felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Abigail Thornton, nearing 80 but still sharp as a tack. The former boarding house owner had sold her business 5 years ago, but remained an active community member and honorary grandmother to the Thornton children. "He looks fine up there," Abigail whispered, nodding toward the stage where Caleb waited with other speakers. At 45, Caleb Thornton cut an imposing figure. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and years of ranch work had weathered his face, but his posture was erect, his gaze confident. The awkward isolation that once cloaked him had long since dissolved, replaced by the assured presence of a man who knew his worth and contributions. Caleb caught Eleanor's eye across the room and quickly signed, nervous. She signed back, "You'll be brilliant." As always. The brief, intimate exchange reflected a connection that had only deepened over the years. They had developed a private language within sign language, shorthand expressions, and inside references that conveyed volumes in a single gesture. Chapter 11, A Community Reimagined. After the mayor's introduction and a speech from the railroad representative, Caleb took the podium. The hall fell silent, a gesture of respect rather than necessity, as he would sign his speech while Professor William Hayes from the Territorial College provided a spoken interpretation. 10 years ago, Caleb began, his signs clear and deliberate. Many believed Willow Creek would remain a small frontier outpost, unchanged and isolated. Some saw that as preserving tradition. Others recognized it as stagnation. Professor Hayes's voice carried Caleb's words through the hall as he continued. The railroad brought physical connection to the wider world. But Willow Creek's true transformation came from another kind of connection, the recognition that diversity of experience strengthens, not weakens, a community. From the front row, Eleanor felt a swell of pride. The man before them spoke with the confidence of one who had found his voice in a world that once sought to silence him. The audience, many of whom had once dismissed him as the deaf rancher, leaned forward, captivated by his insights. My journey in Willow Creek began in isolation, Caleb signed. Like many who are different, I existed at the edges of community life, not through active rejection but through the passive barriers of misunderstanding. He paused, his gaze finding Eleanor. Then a mail-order bride arrived, rejected for being too silent. In finding each other, we discovered that our so-called limitations were the foundation for a deeper understanding. The hall was hushed as Caleb recounted their story, not as a personal anecdote, but as a metaphor for the community's evolution. He spoke of initial resistance, the Founders' Day confrontation, and the gradual shift as practical solutions replaced prejudice. Today, Willow Creek is a model for inclusive community growth, he continued. Our schools teach all children, regardless of ability to hear, speak, or move. Our businesses employ communication methods that enhance efficiency for everyone. Our public events ensure every citizen can participate fully. Thomas leaned against Eleanor, watching his father with unmasked admiration. Unlike his sister, Thomas was born deaf, a discovery that surprised doctors but brought no distress to Caleb and Eleanor. They simply added another dimension to their bilingual family, ensuring both children grew up fluent in sign and speech. The Territorial Commission I now serve will use Willow Creek's experience to develop guidelines for schools across Montana, Caleb signed, not as special accommodations, but as recognition that human diversity demands diverse approaches to communication and education. As Caleb's speech concluded to enthusiastic applause, both waved hands and traditional claps, Eleanor reflected on the journey to this moment. The mail-order arrangement that brought her west had failed in its intended purpose, but succeeded beyond imagination in an entirely different way. After the ceremony, the town square filled with a community picnic. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, venison roasts, cornbread, apple pies, a celebration of Montana's bounty and the town's communal spirit. A band played in the gazebo, and children darted through the summer grass. The Thornton family moved through the crowd, greeting friends and accepting congratulations on Caleb's speech. Mrs. Thornton, a voice Eleanor hadn't heard in years, called. She turned to see an elderly man leaning on a cane approaching. Edward Langley, her father's friend who had once come to Willow Creek to retrieve her. Mr. Langley, she exclaimed, genuinely delighted. The Philadelphia businessman had kept in touch sporadically, but she hadn't expected him to travel so far at his age. I couldn't miss this, he said, his eyes twinkling. When I read about Caleb's appointment in the Boston papers, I had to see what you two have accomplished here. He looked around at the inclusive community, where signed conversations ran parallel to spoken ones, where the Thornton children moved effortlessly between worlds, where difference had become ordinary rather than exceptional. I owe you an apology, Langley said gravely. When I came to take you back to Philadelphia, I couldn't imagine this was possible. I thought you were sacrificing yourself to isolation. Eleanor smiled gently. You wanted what you thought was best for me. But I found something greater here, the freedom to define myself beyond my limitations. Langley nodded thoughtfully. I see that now, and not just for you and Caleb, but for this entire community. You've built something extraordinary. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself drawn to quieter corners of the celebration. She watched Thomas play a complex game with other children, some deaf, some hearing, all communicating through a mix of signs, speech, and the universal language of play. Nearby, Abigail sat with friends from school, their hands flying in conversation despite all having perfect hearing. They had grown up with signs as a natural part of their world, using them instinctively when speech was inconvenient due to distance or noise. Caleb found her there, offering a glass of lemonade as he sat beside her under an oak tree. "Proud of you today," she signed, her fingers conveying what words couldn't fully express. "Proud of us," he corrected. "Everything here grew from what we built together." Eleanor watched a newcomer to town, a young woman with a visible limp, welcomed warmly into a circle of Institute alumni. The woman's face reflected surprise and relief at the effortless inclusion. "Do you ever think how different it could have been," Eleanor sighed, "if James had accepted me that first day at the station?" Caleb's expression turned pensive. "Sometimes. But then I remember what you taught me. That rejection often leads us where we truly belong." The wisdom in his remarks struck Eleanor anew. James's rejection had once seemed devastating, but it had set in motion a journey that transformed not only her life, but an entire community's understanding of difference and capability. Chapter 12. A Circle Completed. As the sun dipped toward the western mountains, casting a golden glow over the celebration, Caleb touched Eleanor's hand to draw her attention across the square. There, unnoticed by most of the crowd, stood an older man observing the festivities with undisguised curiosity. James Caldwell returned to Willow Creek after years away. He caught their gaze, hesitated, then tipped his head in a gesture somewhere between acknowledgement and apology. Caleb, without pause, returned a dignified nod. Eleanor added a small smile, recognizing in James's presence the completion of a circle begun at the train station 15 years ago. The former merchant didn't approach, but continued watching the community that had evolved in his absence, a living testament to the possibilities he'd once dismissed. After a moment, he turned and walked slowly toward the new hotel on Main Street, his back straight despite his age. "Not everyone can change their perceptions," Caleb signed as they watched him go. "But we can change what they perceive," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the thriving, inclusive celebration around them. "Reality speaks louder than prejudice, given enough time." As twilight turned to evening, lanterns were lit around the square. The Henderson family, Jacob now married with children of his own, Clara still sprightly at 70, joined the Thorntons for the traditional dance that closed every Willow Creek celebration. As the fiddler struck up a waltz, Caleb extended his hand to Eleanor, as he had at their first Founders' Day. She took it with the same certainty, though their movements were now smoother, honed by years of dancing together, anticipating each other's rhythms without thought. Their children joined the dance, Abigail with the banker's grandson, Thomas with Rebecca Watson's daughter. All moved to music some heard, and others felt through vibrations and visual cues. Around them, Willow Creek citizens danced in myriad combinations, their differences no longer barriers but variations in the human experience. As Caleb spun her through a turn, Eleanor caught their reflection in the City Hall's window, no longer the anxious mail-order bride and the isolated deaf rancher, but partners who had built something extraordinary from rejection and limitation. They had reached this moment not by denying their differences, but by embracing them, not by overcoming silence, but by discovering its worth. The Montana sky blazed with stars as the celebration stretched into the night. Each pinprick of light was distinct, yet part of a vast pattern. Below, a community celebrated not just its city status, but its evolution into a place where communication flowed through many forms, where capability was recognized in diverse expressions, and where two people once defined by what they lacked had redefined what it meant to be whole. In the end, the silent bride rejected for her quietude, and the deaf rancher who saw beauty in her stillness didn't just forge a marriage or a family, but a legacy of understanding that would echo beyond Montana's borders. Theirs was a testament to the unexpected gifts that come when rejection leads not to bitterness, but to the place where we truly belong. If this story has touched your heart, there are two more remarkable tales waiting for you. Click to explore them, and don't forget to follow and turn on notifications to catch every update from us.